The rain in Seattle doesn't fall so much as it suspends itself in the air, a gray, heavy veil that clings to the windows of the house I spent 32 years turning into a home. I stood in the mudroom, my coat still damp, the scent of cedar and expensive floor wax rising to meet me. It is a scent I curated. Every Sunday, I wax the oak. Every morning, I replenish the cedar sachets in the closets. I didn't make a sound as I stepped out of my shoes. I have spent 3 decades perfecting the art of moving through this house without disturbing the air. It was a skill I once thought was a virtue, the quiet grace of a wife who keeps the machinery of a family running on silent gears. Now, I realize it was simply my disappearance. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of Arthur's laughter was a low, resonant vibration that I usually only heard when he was on the phone with his firm's partners. It was a sound of genuine ease. And then there was a lighter sound, a melodic, practiced tinkle of a laugh that belonged to Mara. Mara is 34. She is the daughter of our oldest friends, a woman I had held as a colicky infant. She had been interning with Arthur's architectural firm for the last year, seeking his seasoned mentorship. I walked toward the archway of the living room, my stockinged feet sinking into the Persian rug I had bought in Isfahan during our 20th anniversary trip. I stopped just behind the heavy velvet curtain. They were on the sofa, the one I had reupholstered in a cream silk that Arthur complained was too delicate for real life. Mara was leaning into him, her hand resting on his forearm with a casual, terrifying familiarity. She was holding a glass of the 1982 Bordeaux Arthur had been saving for his retirement. My glass. I knew it by the slight chip on the base that I always turned away from the guest. "She won't be back until 6, Arthur was saying, his voice thick with a comfort that felt like a serrated blade against my skin.
Elena takes the bridge club far too seriously. They spend more time gossiping about the help than they do playing cards.
"She's a saint, Arthur," Mara whispered, though her eyes were dancing with a cruel sort of pity. "I don't know how she does it. The house is always so perfect, like a museum. Doesn't it feel cold?" Arthur sighed, a sound of heavy, performed exhaustion. "It's a gilded cage, Mara. She likes the cages. She built them." I watched him reach out and tuck a stray hair behind her ear. It was a gesture so intimate, so devoid of the performative affection he saved for our public appearances, that it felt like watching a stranger inhabit my husband's skin. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop my handbag. I didn't rush in to demand an explanation that I already possessed. Instead, I felt a strange, icy clarity settle over me. I looked at the dust motes dancing in the light of the floor lamp I had polished yesterday. I looked at the man I had supported through 3 firm failures and 2 heart scares. I realized, in that moment, that I was the only thing holding the walls of this life up. I was the foundation, the insulation, and the roof. And they were sitting in the warmth I provided, mocking the fire I had built. I backed away, inch by inch, returning to the mudroom. I opened the heavy oak door and closed it again, this time with a deliberate, heavy thud. "Arthur? I'm home early," I called out, my voice steady, pitched in the cheerful, slightly vapid tone I knew he expected. "The club folded early. Diane had a migraine." I heard the frantic rustle of fabric, the clink of a glass being set down too quickly on the mahogany coffee table. I waited exactly 10 seconds, the time it takes to walk from the door to the archway, and then I entered the room. Arthur was standing by the fireplace, adjusting his tie.
Mara was smoothing her skirt. Her face flushed a soft, guilty pink that he likely found endearing. "Elena."
"You're back," Arthur said, his smile tight, the architect's mask firmly in place.
Mara dropped by with the renderings for the Thompson project. We were just finishing up.
"Mara, dear, how lovely," I said, walking toward her. I didn't look at Arthur. I looked at the glass of Bordeaux on the table. There was a smear of her coral lipstick on the rim. "You look parched. Arthur, why haven't you offered our guest something more than a half-finished bottle of wine?" "I was just leaving, Mrs. Vance," Mara said, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't as good an actor as he was. Not yet. "Nonsense," I replied, my smile widening. It was a smile I had practiced in the mirror for years, the smile of the perfect hostess who sees nothing she doesn't wish to see. "Stay for dinner. I've prepared a lamb roast. There's plenty. We were just saying how this house feels a bit too large lately, weren't we, Arthur?" Arthur looked at me, his brow furrowing. He was looking for the crack. He was looking for the tears, the accusations, the leverage he could use to turn my hysteria into his burden. But I gave him nothing but a calm, vacant stare. "Yes," Arthur said slowly, his tension easing just a fraction. "Stay, Mara. Elena's lamb is legendary." As I walked into the kitchen to begin the labor of a 3-course meal for my husband and his mistress, I didn't feel the usual weight of resentment. I felt a lightness. For 30 years, I had been the air they breathed, vital but invisible. They had forgotten that air can be withdrawn. They had forgotten that a vacuum is the most absolute form of isolation. I pulled the heavy silver tray from the cupboard. It was tarnished. I would let it stay that way. In the living room, I heard Arthur laugh again, though it was a shorter, more guarded sound. He thought he had escaped. He thought my silence was the same silence he had been ignoring for decades. He didn't realize that my silence was no longer a sign of endurance. It was a renovation. I looked at the phone on the counter. A notification glowed. A message from our son Julian asking if I could watch the kids this weekend so he and his wife could go to Napa. I deleted the message without replying. The first brick was gone. I wondered how many more I could pull before they noticed the ceiling beginning to sag. The dinner was a masterclass in choreographed discomfort. I moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the practiced fluidity of a ghost. I had set the table with the Wedgwood china, the set we only used for visiting dignitaries or the rare occasions our children brought home someone they actually wanted to impress. Mara sat in the seat usually reserved for my daughter, Claire. It felt like a deliberate sacrilege. She looked small against the high-backed mahogany chair, her hands folded neatly on the linen placemat I had hand-pressed only 3 days ago. "This is truly delicious, Elena," Mara said, her voice a little too high, a little too eager to please. She poked at the lamb with a silver fork. "The rosemary is so fresh." "I grow it in the garden," I said, pouring a splash of sparkling water into her glass. I noticed the way Arthur's eyes followed my hand, searching for a tremor, a sign of the storm he expected. When he found none, he visibly relaxed, his shoulders dropping an inch. "Elena has a way with living things," Arthur said, his tone dripping with a condescension so familiar it felt like a second skin. "She nurtures them until they have no choice but to flourish. It's a very controlling kind of kindness." He laughed, and Mara joined in, a short, nervous titter. I smiled back, the expression never quite reaching my eyes. "Is that how you see it, Arthur?" I asked softly. "I always thought of it as providing a foundation. It's hard to grow when the soil is thin." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the rhythmic scraping of knives against porcelain. Arthur cleared his throat, shifting the conversation to the firm. He began explaining a structural issue with the Thompson Museum project, a cantilevered wing that was proving difficult to stabilize. He spoke to Mara as if I weren't there, or perhaps as if I were a piece of furniture that happened to be capable of serving gravy. I watched him. I watched the way he used his hands to describe the lines of the building, the same hands that had been on her waist 30 minutes prior. I realized then that Arthur didn't just want Mara. He wanted the version of himself that Mara saw. To her, he was the brilliant architect, the mentor, the lion. To me, he was the man who forgot to take his cholesterol medication unless I put it in his hand. He was the man who couldn't find his own black socks, even though they had been in the same drawer for 30 years. He hated me because I knew his mundane truths. He loved her because she believed his curated lies. The load-bearing walls are the problem, Mara said, leaning in, her eyes shining with a simulated professional intensity. They can't support the weight of the glass without more reinforcement. Exactly, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that intimate register again. But the client wants transparency. They want it to look like it's floating. Nothing floats without a cost, I interrupted quietly. I began stacking the plates, the clatter of the china a sharp punctuation mark. Eventually, the weight has to go somewhere, usually into the ground, where no one sees the strain. Arthur's smile faltered. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time all evening. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, a brief moment where he wondered if I was talking about architecture or about the woman standing before him with a stack of dirty dishes. But the moment passed. He dismissed the thought. He had spent decades underestimating my intelligence. He wasn't going to start respecting it now. After Mara left, fleeing into the rain with a rushed thank you, the house settled into a suffocating quiet. Arthur went to his study, closing the door with a firm click that signaled he was working and was not to be disturbed. It was his way of avoiding the post-dinner conversation that usually involved us discussing the kids or the household budget. I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands submerged in hot, soapy water. I picked up the wine glass Mara had used. The coral lipstick was still there, a stubborn smudge on the rim. In the past, I would have scrubbed it clean, erasing the evidence of his indiscretion to preserve the peace of our home. Instead, I set the glass aside, unwashed. I placed it on the top shelf of the pantry, behind the flower jars. A small, hidden monument to his betrayal. My phone vibrated on the counter. It was Julian again. "Mom, did you see my text? Sarah and I really need this weekend. The kids are driving us crazy, and we haven't had a night alone in months. Let me know the drop-off time." In the past, I would have replied instantly. I would have rearranged my Saturday, canceled my gardening club, and prepared the guest rooms with the grandkids' favorite sheets. I would have felt a surge of maternal guilt if I had even thought about saying no. I looked at the message. I thought about the way Julian spoke to me, always a request, never an inquiry about my life. I was a service provider. I was the safety net. I typed back, "I have plans this weekend. I won't be able to take the children. I'm sure you and Sarah can find a sitter." The reply was almost instantaneous. "Plans? What plans? Mom, we already booked the hotel. You're always free on weekends. Is everything okay?" I didn't answer. I put the phone on silent and placed it face down on the granite. I walked through the darkened house, turning off the lamps one by one. I paused at the door of Arthur's study. A sliver of light escaped from beneath the door. I could hear the low murmur of his voice. He was on his cell phone. Not a business call. The tone was too light, too playful. He was already reaching out to her, checking in, making sure she got home safe, reinforcing the secret bond they shared against the cold museum of his home. I didn't feel the urge to burst in and scream. I didn't feel the need to cry. I simply felt finished. I went upstairs to our bedroom, the room with the Egyptian cotton sheets and the photos of our wedding on the mantel. I looked at the man in the photo, 30 years younger, looking at me with what I had once mistaken for devotion. I realized he hadn't changed. He had always been this man. I was the one who had changed. I was the one who had stopped providing the light that made him look like a hero. I lay down on my side of the bed, the expanse of the mattress feeling like a desert between me and the empty space where my husband usually slept. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain. Tomorrow, I would start looking at the bank accounts. Arthur thought he was the architect of our lives, but he had forgotten who had actually signed the checks, managed the investments, and kept the books for the last 3 decades. He thought he was leaving me for something newer. He didn't realize I was already halfway out the door, and I was taking the walls with me. The morning light was a cold, surgical blue, cutting through the slats of the blinds in the kitchen. Usually, by 7:15 a.m., the house smelled of dark roast coffee and toasted sourdough. Usually, Arthur's vitamins were placed in a neat row beside a glass of room-temperature lemon water. Usually, his dry-cleaned shirt for the day was hanging on the valet in his dressing room, the cufflinks already threaded through the French cuffs. This morning, I sat at the small breakfast nook with a single cup of herbal tea. The kitchen was silent. The stovetop was cold. I heard Arthur's heavy tread on the stairs, the sound of a man who expects the world to be ready for him. He entered the kitchen, his silk robe tied loosely, his eyes already scanning the counter for the coffee carafe that wasn't there. "Elena," he said, his voice husky with sleep, tinged with a note of confused irritation. "Did the machine break?" "I didn't make any," I said, not looking up from my tea. I felt like something quiet this morning. The sound of the grinder felt too aggressive. Arthur paused. He stood in the center of the kitchen, my kitchen, looking like a traveler who had found a landmark missing from his map. He hovered near the sink, his hands twitching as if he might make it himself, before the sheer weight of decades of domestic service pulled him back. He didn't know where the filters were kept. He didn't know the ratio of beans to water. "Right," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "Well, I suppose I can grab something at the office." He waited, perhaps for me to offer to go to the Starbucks down the road, or to apologize for my mood. I did neither. I watched a single crow land on the bird feeder outside. It pecked at the wood, finding it empty. I had stopped filling it yesterday. "Are you feeling all right?" Arthur asked, his tone shifting to that practiced, patronizing concern he used when he wanted to remind me of my frailty. "You've seemed a bit distant since dinner last night. Was it something Mara said? You know she's just young and a bit overeager. Her father is very important to the firm's expansion." I looked at him then. His hair was thinning at the crown, a detail he spent a lot of money trying to hide with expensive products I had to order for him. He looked old, not distinguished, just tired. "I'm perfectly fine, Arthur," I said, offering him a thin, brittle smile. "I'm just practicing my architecture." He blinked. "What?" "The cantilevered wing you mentioned," I said. "The one that wants to look like it's floating." I've realized that for something to appear as though it's defying gravity, the supports have to be completely invisible. But the moment you see the supports, the illusion is ruined, isn't it? It just looks like a heavy thing being held up by a tired thing. Arthur stared at me for a long beat. He didn't like it when I spoke in metaphors. He preferred me to speak in grocery lists and social calendars. He let out a short, dismissive huff of air.
You're being cryptic, Elena. It doesn't suit you. He walked out of the room, his dignity slightly bruised by the lack of caffeine. Once I heard the shower running upstairs. I went to the built-in desk in the corner of the den. This was the nerve center of the Vance household. While Arthur designed skyscrapers and museums, I designed the life that allowed him to do so. I opened the heavy leather binder where I kept our private ledgers. Arthur was the principal of Vance & Associates, but I was the one who had incorporated the business 30 years ago using my inheritance from my grandmother. I was the one who had handled the payroll in the lean years. I was the one who had quietly moved personal assets into a separate trust a decade ago when Arthur wanted to gamble on a high-risk development in Dubai that eventually folded. He thought our wealth was a result of his genius. He didn't realize his genius had been subsidized by my caution. I logged into our joint investment account. The balance was substantial, but it was the liquidity that mattered. I began the process of moving my half of the discretionary funds into an account he couldn't access, an account in my maiden name, Sterling. The phone rang. It was the landline, a relic I kept because the school system and the hospital still had it on file. Mom? Why aren't you answering your cell? It was Claire, my youngest.
She was 30, a high-end real estate agent in San Francisco who called me only when she was driving between showings and needed to vent about her incompetent assistant or her toxic dating life. "I have it on silent, Claire," I said. "Is everything okay?" "Not really. Listen, Julian told me you said no to watching the kids this weekend. Is that a joke? Sarah already bought the spa package. She's going to have a literal breakdown if she doesn't get away. You know how she gets." "I'm sure Sarah is capable of managing her own stress," I said evenly. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Wow. Okay. Who is this and what have you done with my mother?" "Look, I actually called because I'm coming up for the gallery opening on Friday and I need you to drop my black cocktail dress at the specialty cleaners, the one on 4th. I've got a stain on the hem and I need it pristine by Friday evening. I'll courier it to the house this afternoon." I looked at the mahogany desk, at the dust I hadn't wiped away this morning. "I won't be here this afternoon, Claire," I said. "What? Where are you going?" "Out," I said. "And I won't be doing your errands. You're 30 years old. There are apps for these things now." "Mom, what is wrong with you? You're being so mean lately. Is this a menopause thing? Should I call Dad?" "Do whatever you feel is necessary, Claire," I said. "But the dress will stay in the box if it arrives." I hung up before she could respond. The silence that followed was delicious. It was the sound of a vacuum forming. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the unwashed wine glass in the pantry. I took it out and looked at the coral smudge. I thought about Mara's laugh. I thought about Arthur's hand on her arm. I realized that my children and my husband all viewed me the same way, as a piece of infrastructure, like the plumbing or the electricity. You don't notice it until it stops working. And when it does, you don't feel sorry for the pipes. You just feel angry that you can't have a hot shower. I took the wine glass and placed it back on the shelf. But this time, I moved it to the very front, right where Arthur would see it when he went looking for his scotch tonight. I grabbed my car keys and my handbag. For the first time in 32 years, I left the house without checking if the dishwasher was running, without making the bed, and without leaving a note on the counter explaining where I was going and when I would be back. As I backed the Volvo out of the driveway, I saw Arthur standing at the bedroom window, his tie half done, watching me with an expression of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. He looked like a man watching his own shadow walk away from him. I spent the afternoon in the botanical gardens, a place Arthur always called a waste of prime real estate. I sat on a stone bench and watched the koi move beneath the lily pads. They were orange flashes of pure, thoughtless intent. They didn't care who fed them, only that they were fed. I wondered if my family was really any different. When I returned home at 5, the house felt cavernous. Usually, this was the hour of the great synchronization. I would be checking the internal temperature of the roast, dimming the lights to evening levels, and ensuring the mail was sorted by importance on Arthur's desk. Instead, the mail was scattered across the entryway floor where the mailman had slid it through the slot. A single bill from the water company sat face up, showing a late notice. I hadn't paid it. I wanted to see if Arthur even knew where the checkbook was kept. I found Julian in the kitchen. He was leaning against the island, his face red, his expensive wool coat still on. He was staring at the pantry, holding a bag of artisanal coffee beans like they were a foreign artifact. "Mom," he said, turning to me. His voice had that sharp, jagged edge of a man whose convenience has been compromised. "I've been calling you for 3 hours. The courier dropped off Claire's dress and it's just sitting there on the porch. And Sarah is in tears. We had to cancel the deposit on the Napa suite because we couldn't find a last-minute sitter." I walked past him and took a bottle of San Pellegrino from the fridge. I didn't offer him one. "I told you I was busy, Julian," I said. "Busy doing what?" He threw his hands up, a gesture he inherited from Arthur. "You were at the gardens? You don't even like the gardens that much. You only go there when you're, I don't know, moping? Is this about Dad's late nights? Because if it is, you need to just talk to him instead of taking it out on us." I paused, the cold glass of the bottle pressed against my palm. I looked at my son, the boy I had stayed up with through every fever, the man whose college tuition I had meticulously saved for while Arthur wanted to buy a sailboat. He didn't see a woman who had been betrayed. He saw a malfunctioning appliance that was ruining his weekend. "Taking it out on you?" I asked softly. "Is that what you think this is? A tantrum?" "I don't know what it is, but Sarah is stressed, Claire is complaining that her dress is going to be wrinkled, and the house smells like nothing. It usually smells like dinner." "It smells like a house, Julian, not a restaurant." I took a slow sip of the water. "If Sarah is stressed, perhaps you should stay home and help her with the children. That is what a husband does, isn't it?" Julian recoiled as if I'd slapped him. "I work 60 hours a week, Mom. I provide. This weekend was supposed to be my reward." "And what is my reward, Julian? For the last 30 years of providing the reward for everyone else?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer because the question itself was outside his vocabulary. In his world, my labor was a natural resource, like sunlight. You don't thank the sun for shining, you just complain when it's cloudy. "Whatever," he muttered, reaching for his keys. "Dad was right. You're going through something. I'll just tell Sarah we're staying home. I hope you're happy." He slammed the door on his way out. The vibration rattled the china in the hutch. I didn't flinch. I felt a strange, surgical detachment. Every time they lashed out, another cord of guilt that had bound me to them simply snapped. I walked into the pantry. The wine glass was gone. I felt a small prickle of heat in my chest. Arthur had found it. I walked into the living room. Arthur was sitting in his leather armchair, the one that faced the window. He wasn't reading. He wasn't on his phone. He was just sitting there in the dim light. On the side table, next to his usual crystal tumbler of scotch, sat the wine glass. It was still unwashed. The coral lipstick smudge seemed to glow under the lamp's warm light. "Elena," he said.
He didn't turn around. Yes, Arthur? I found this in the pantry, behind the flour. Did you? I must have missed it when I was clearing up after Mara left. He finally turned. His face was a mask of controlled composure, but I could see the pulse thrumming in his neck. He was an architect. He knew when a structure was under a load it wasn't designed to carry. You didn't miss it, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous floor. You put it there. Why? Perhaps I wanted to see if you'd notice, I said, walking toward him. I stopped just a few feet away. You notice so little in this house, Arthur. You don't notice when the rugs are cleaned. You don't notice when the taxes are paid. You don't even notice when I'm in the room half the time. I leaned over and picked up the glass. I held it up to the light, turning it slowly. But you noticed this, I continued. Why? Is it because the color is so vibrant? Or is it because you recognize the shade? It's sunset coral, isn't it? I believe her mother wears the same one. It runs in the family, I suppose. The taste for things that don't belong to them. Arthur's hand tightened around his scotch glass. For a second, I thought it might shatter. She's a girl, Elena. She's young and she admires me. It's nothing. It's a distraction from the pressure of the firm. A distraction, I repeated. I set the glass back down on the table, right next to his hand. And what am I, Arthur? The foundation? The load-bearing wall? You're my wife, he said, as if the title itself was a solution. A wife is a person, Arthur, not a role. You've treated me like a role for so long, you've forgotten the person who's playing it. And roles can be recast. Isn't that what you were doing yesterday? Rehearsing with a new lead? He stood up then, his height meant to intimidate. I won't have this. I won't have you lurking in corners and leaving cryptic reminders in the pantry, like a character in a Gothic novel. If you have something to say it. I have nothing left to say to you, Arthur. I've spent 30 years saying everything. I've cheered your successes. I've cushioned your failures. I've whispered the right names in your ear at parties when you forgot them. I've said it all. I turned to leave the room. Where are you going? He barked. To bed, I said. In the guest room. I find the mattress in our room is a bit too soft. It lacks support. I didn't wait for his response. I climbed the stairs, the silence of the house following me like a loyal dog. As I closed the door to the guest room, the one I usually kept perfectly made for company that never came, I realized that Arthur was still standing in the living room, alone with that glass. He thought he was the one in control, because he was the one who had strayed. He didn't realize that by straying, he had handed me the keys to the exit. He was terrified of a scene. He was prepared for a fight, for tears, for a divorce lawyer's phone number. He was prepared for me to be hysterical. He wasn't prepared for me to be indifferent. I looked at the guest bed. The sheets were crisp and cold. I lay down and felt the silence of the house pressing in on me. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a weapon. Tomorrow, I would visit the bank again, and then I would visit a realtor. Arthur wanted a museum. I was going to give him one. A perfectly preserved, silent, and entirely empty space where his life used to be. The guest room was a study in beige and stillness. I woke at 6 a.m., not to the sound of Arthur's heavy-handed alarm, but to the chirping of a single persistent sparrow outside the window. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel the immediate, crushing weight of the morning list, the mental tally of shirts to be pressed, lunches to be packed,
and moods to be managed. I smoothed the duvet. It was cold. I felt a strange, detached satisfaction in that coldness. When I went downstairs, the house felt different. It was the same furniture, the same expensive art, but the spirit of the place, the invisible hum of my constant attention, had begun to evaporate. Dust had settled on the foyer table. I saw it, noted it, and walked right past it. I found Arthur in the kitchen. He was standing over the trash can, scraping a piece of blackened toast into the bin. He was dressed in his charcoal suit, but his tie was slightly crooked, and there was a smudge of something, jam perhaps, on his cuff. Without me there to perform the final check before he left the house, he was beginning to fray at the edges. "The guest room, Elena? Really?" he asked, not looking at me. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous that would look if Julian or Claire had stayed over?" "It's a comfortable bed, Arthur, and since we're both adults, I didn't think we needed to perform for an empty house." "There's a dinner tonight," he said, his voice tightening. "The AIA Regional Gala. We've had the tickets for months. I assume you're still coming. It would be noted if you weren't there." "Noted by whom? Mara?" He slammed the toaster lever down with more force than necessary. "By the board. By our friends. My God, Elena, can you put your pride aside for one evening? It's a professional obligation." "I have a headache, Arthur. The kind that doesn't go away with aspirin. I think I'll stay in. You can tell them I'm under the weather. Or tell them the truth, that I've simply decided to stop attending events where I'm treated as a decorative backdrop." He turned, his face flushed. "You're being vindictive. You're trying to embarrass me because I made a mistake." "I'm not trying to do anything to you, Arthur. That's what you don't understand. I'm just stopping. I'm retiring from the business of being Mrs. Arthur Vance." He opened his mouth to retort, but the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, aggressive sound. I opened the door to find Julian and Claire standing on the porch. Julian looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, likely from a night of Sarah's stress. Claire was holding a garment bag, the black cocktail dress, and her expression was one of practiced indignation. "We need to talk," Julian said, pushing past me into the foyer. They marched into the kitchen, a united front of neglected children. Arthur stood by the island, looking relieved to have reinforcements. "Mom, this has gone far enough," Claire said, tossing the garment bag onto the kitchen table, the table where I usually served Sunday brunch. "The cleaners wouldn't take the dress because I didn't have the membership card. I had to pay double, and they can't guarantee it by tonight. And Julian tells me you're refusing to help with the kids?" "I'm not refusing, Claire," I said, leaning against the counter. "I'm just not available. There's a difference." "You're always available," Julian barked. "That's the point. Sarah had to call her mother in Florida to fly up because we couldn't find anyone else. Do you know how much that flight cost? Do you know how much drama that's going to cause?" I looked at my son. I saw the way his jaw was set, the way he looked at me not as a person who might be hurting, but as a failed logistics manager. "I'm sure the cost of the flight is less than the cost of 30 years of free childcare, Julian," I said softly. The room went silent. Even Arthur looked stunned. I had never mentioned the cost of my love before. It was a taboo in our family, the idea that my sacrifices had a value that could be measured. "Is this about money?" Claire asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Are you having some kind of midlife crisis where you want to be paid for being a grandmother?" "It's not about money, Claire. It's about air," I said.
I've been the heir in this family for a long time. You don't notice air until it gets thin. And right now, I think you're all starting to gasp a little. This is Dad's fault, isn't it? Julian said, turning to Arthur. What did you do? Did you forget an anniversary? Did you work too late? Arthur shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the pantry where the wine glass had been. Your mother is just feeling overwhelmed. We're working through it. We aren't working through anything, Arthur, I corrected. Working through implies a destination where things go back to the way they were. I have no intention of going back there. I walked over to the table and picked up Claire's garment bag. I handed it back to her. The gala is tonight, Claire. If you want the dress cleaned, you'll have to find a way. And Julian, tell Sarah I hope she enjoys her time with her mother.
I'll be out this evening, so don't bother calling the house. Out where? Arthur demanded. To dinner, I said, with an old friend, someone who remembers who I was before I became your wife. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the three of them standing there. As I reached the stairs, I heard Julian whisper, "Is she having an affair?" And then I heard Arthur's voice, low and cracked. She's doing something much worse, Julian. She's leaving without moving an inch. I went to the guest room and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They were steady. I realized then that I wasn't just withdrawing my labor. I was withdrawing my presence. I was turning the house into a shell. They wanted to live in a world where I didn't matter? Fine. I would give them exactly that. I would become a ghost in my own hallways, a shadow they couldn't catch, a silence they couldn't fill. I reached into my bedside drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. In it, I had started a list. Not a grocery list, not a list of chores. It was a list of every asset Arthur thought was his alone. The first entry was the beach house in Oregon, the one he had bought with his bonus 5 years ago. He didn't know that the title was held by a shell company I had set up, a company where I was the sole director. He had signed the papers without reading them, trusting me to handle the boring details. I felt a cold, sharp prickle of power. Tonight, while he was at the gala, pretending everything was fine, I was going to change the locks on the Oregon house. And then, I was going to call the gardener and tell him we no longer required his services for this property. Let the weeds grow. Let the dust settle. Let them see what happens when the safety net decides to become a trap. The ritual of the AIA Gala had, for 3 decades, been the anchor of our social calendar. Every year, I would spend weeks coordinating the dress, the jewelry, the seating charts he wanted me to influence, the talking points about the firm's latest acquisitions. I was the diplomat. I was the one who smoothed over Arthur's occasional arrogance with a well-timed anecdote or a graceful redirection of the conversation. This evening, the master bedroom sounded like a battlefield. I sat in the guest room, the door slightly ajar, listening to the frantic opening and closing of drawers. I heard the distinct thud of a shoe hitting the floor, followed by a muffled curse. Elena? His voice was taut, vibrating with a high-frequency panic. I didn't answer. I continued to brush my hair, watching my reflection. I looked different. The lines around my eyes seemed less like marks of exhaustion and more like a map of a territory I was finally reclaiming. A few moments later, Arthur appeared in the doorway. He was half-dressed. His tuxedo shirt was unbuttoned, his silk tie hanging limp around his neck like a dead snake. He was holding a pair of silver cufflinks, the ones I had bought him in London, as if they were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I can't get these in," he said. He didn't ask, he stated it, waiting for me to stand up and perform the task. and I can't find the studs for the shirt. I've looked everywhere. They're in the velvet box, Arthur, in the third drawer of your valet. I looked there. It's empty. Then you must have moved them, I said, my voice as cool as the evening air. I didn't move from my chair. I haven't touched your valet in 48 hours. He stared at me, his face turning a mottled shade of red. The car will be here in 20 minutes. I have to give the opening remarks. You can't seriously expect me to go like this. I expect you to manage your own wardrobe, Arthur. You're a man who designs multi-million-dollar structures. I'm sure you can navigate a buttonhole. This is petty, Elena. It's beneath you.
Is it? I stood up. I was wearing a simple tailored navy suit, not a gown, not something meant to complement his tuxedo. I looked professional, self-contained. What is beneath me, Arthur, is being the invisible scaffolding for a man who doesn't even acknowledge I exist until he can't find his jewelry. He took a step toward me, his eyes narrowing. You're enjoying this. You're enjoying watching me struggle. I'm not enjoying it, Arthur. I'm just observing it. It's interesting to see how quickly the great architect crumbles when his support staff takes a night off. I picked up my clutch and walked past him. He reached out to grab my arm, but I stepped aside with a fluid, practiced grace that left him clutching at the air. I'll be home late, I said over my shoulder. Don't wait up, and do try to straighten your tie. You look unraveled. I drove myself to a small, quiet bistro on the other side of the city, a place where Arthur would never go because the wine list wasn't prestigious enough. I sat at a corner table and ordered a glass of scotch. Not wine. Scotch. I wanted something that burned. I wasn't meeting an old friend. That had been a small, necessary lie to see the flicker of jealousy, or perhaps just the fear of loss, in Arthur's eyes. Instead, I was meeting with Marcus Thorne. Marcus had been Arthur's first partner, a man Arthur had pushed out of the firm 20 years ago in a ruthless power play that I had helped facilitate. At the time, I believed Arthur's version of the story, that Marcus was stagnant, that he was holding the firm back. Now, I saw it for what it was. The first time Arthur had replaced a loyal foundation with something he could more easily control. Marcus arrived 5 minutes late, looking older, grayer, but with a kindness in his eyes that Arthur had long ago traded for prestige. Elena, he said, taking my hand. You sounded different on the phone. I feel different, Marcus. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the past, but about the structure of Vance & Associates. I knew things Marcus didn't. I knew about the offshore accounts Arthur had started using for consulting fees to Mara's father's company. I knew about the shortcuts being taken on the Thompson project to maximize the year-end bonuses. Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked, his voice low. Because an architect knows that if a building is compromised at its core, the safest thing to do is a controlled demolition, I said. I'm not looking for revenge, Marcus. I'm looking for an exit. And I want to make sure that when the dust settles, I'm the one holding the deed to the land. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and something that felt uncomfortably like pity. You've been playing the long game, haven't you? I didn't realize I was playing a game at all until I found out I was the only one following the rules, I replied. When I returned home at 11, the house was dark, save for a single light in the foyer. Arthur's coat was thrown over the banister. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the kitchen counter, the bread already curling at the edges. I walked into the living room. Arthur was sitting in the dark, still in his tuxedo trousers, his shirt open. He looked defeated. How was the gala? I asked, turning on a small lamp. He didn't look at me. A disaster. Everyone asked where you were. I had to tell them you were ill. And then Mara showed up. Oh? I thought she was just an intern. She made a scene, Elena. She was drinking. She cornered me in front of the board chairman. She thinks there's a future for us. He looked up at me then, his eyes pleading. He wanted me to fix it. He wanted me to call Mara's mother, to smooth it over, to reestablish the boundaries he had so carelessly broken. He wanted his fixer back. That sounds exhausting, Arthur, I said, my voice devoid of empathy. I hope you managed to handle it with your usual genius. Elena, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll fire her tomorrow. I'll make it right. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, just a profound sense of boredom. You can't fire her, Arthur. Her father is your biggest investor for the new museum wing. If you fire her, the funding disappears. And if you don't fire her, she'll keep making scenes until your reputation is in tatters. I leaned down, my face inches from his. You've built yourself a very beautiful cage, Arthur. I'm just sorry I won't be there to help you polish the bars. I turned and walked toward the stairs. Wait, he called out. What did you mean by that? Won't be there. I didn't answer. I reached the landing and looked down at the hallway. The silence of the house felt like a physical weight now, a pressure that was slowly crushing the life out of the rooms I had spent decades filling. I went into the guest room and locked the door. I picked up my phone. There was a message from the locksmith I had called this afternoon. Work complete at the Oregon property. New codes sent to your private email. Alarm system updated. I deleted the message. In the room below me, I heard the sound of glass breaking. Arthur had dropped his drink. In the past, I would have rushed down with a cloth and a vacuum, worried about the stain on the rug. Tonight, I just turned off the light and closed my eyes. Let the glass stay where it fell. Let the stain set. Some things, once broken, aren't meant to be mended. The morning air was thick with the smell of stale scotch and something metallic, the scent of a household's internal machinery grinding to a halt. I found the broken glass exactly where I expected it to be, shattered across the Persian rug in the living room, a constellation of jagged shards glinting in the early sun. In the past, I would have been on my knees with a handheld vacuum and a roll of adhesive tape before the sun was fully up, terrified that a stray splinter might find its way into someone's foot. Today, I simply walked around it. I walked to the kitchen, made myself a piece of dry toast, and sat at the small bistro table by the window. Arthur emerged at 9 a.m. He looked as though he had aged 5 years in a single night. His eyes were bloodshot, and he hadn't shaved. He was wearing a tattered cardigan I had tried to throw away years ago, a garment he only wore when he felt particularly sorry for himself. He stopped at the edge of the living room, staring at the broken glass. "Elena," he croaked. "The glass, I dropped it last night." "I see that," I said, taking a slow bite of my toast. "Aren't you going to—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the mess. "Am I going to what, Arthur? Clean it up?" "No, I didn't break it. And as I recall, you were the one who told me last month that I obsess over the trivialities of the house too much. I'm trying to be less obsessive, for my health." He stared at me, his mouth hanging open slightly. He looked like a man who had walked into his own bathroom and found the gravity had been reversed. He stood there for a long minute, waiting for the punchline, for the moment I would laugh, call him a clumsy bear, and get the broom. When I didn't move, he turned and went to the utility closet. I heard the clatter of the dustpan, the curse as he realized the broom was tucked behind the vacuum he didn't know how to empty. The sound of him sweeping was rhythmic and clumsy. He was pushing the glass deeper into the fibers of the rug rather than lifting it out. I watched him through the archway. It was like watching a child try to perform surgery. He lacked the fine motor skills of domesticity. He had spent his life building skyscrapers, yet he couldn't navigate a 3-foot patch of silk and wool. The landline rang. I didn't move. "Elena? The phone!" Arthur called out, his voice straining with the effort of bending over. "I hear it, Arthur." "Well, are you going to answer it?" "I'm eating my breakfast. If it's important, they'll leave a message." He let out a growl of frustration, dropped the broom, and lunged for the receiver in the kitchen. "Hello? Yes. Yes, Julian. No, she's right here. She's eating toast." Arthur handed the phone to me, his expression a mix of bewilderment and burgeoning rage. "It's your son. He sounds frantic." I took the phone. "Yes, Julian?" "Mom, what is going on over there? Sarah is in a state. She said you blocked her number? And Claire is calling me crying because you won't help her with the gala fallout. She said you were cold to her yesterday." "I haven't blocked anyone, Julian. I've simply prioritized my own peace. And Claire is a grown woman. If she's upset about a dress or a party, she has a therapist for that." "Mom, listen to me." Julian's voice dropped into a patronizing, rational tone. "Dad called me this morning. He's worried about you. He thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. We're coming over, all of us. We're going to have a family meeting." "A family meeting," I repeated. The phrase felt like a heavy, rusted coin. How nostalgic. Will there be an agenda? Or is this just another opportunity for everyone to tell me how my behavior is inconveniencing them? "We'll be there at 6. Have dinner ready so we can talk like civilized people." He hung up before I could reply. Have dinner ready. The command was so reflexive, so deeply embedded in his understanding of our relationship that he didn't even realize he had said it. I handed the receiver back to Arthur. "They're coming over at 6, I said, "for a meeting." Arthur's face brightened. He saw this as the cavalry arriving. He saw his children as the reinforcements who would help him beat back the strange, silent rebellion and restore the status quo. "Good," he said, straightening his shoulders. "Good. We need to clear the air, Elena. This experiment of yours has gone far enough. We're a family. We don't live like this." "You're right, Arthur," I said, standing up and clearing my single plate. "We don't live like this. We live like a parasite and its host. But the host is tired. The host is going for a walk." I spent the afternoon at the bank. I met with a private wealth manager, a woman named Sarah, no relation to my daughter-in-law, who looked at my ledgers with a sharp, appreciative eye. "You've been very thorough, Mrs. Vance," she said. "The way these trusts are structured, it's essentially a legal labyrinth. If your husband tried to liquidate the firm's primary holdings, he'd find himself hitting a wall at every turn." "I didn't build it to hurt him," I said, and for the first time, it was the truth. I built it to protect the family from his impulsiveness. I just didn't realize that eventually I would need protection from the family itself. "And the Oregon property?" "The locks are changed. The utilities have been moved to my private account. As far as the state is concerned, that house is an independent entity." When I returned home at 5:30, the driveway was full. Julian's SUV, Claire's convertible, and Arthur's sedan were lined up like a fleet of expensive grievances. I walked into the house. The lights were all on. every single one. It was a waste of electricity that usually would have set my teeth on edge. The smell of the house was different too. They had ordered pizza. The greasy, cardboard scent of it felt like an insult to the kitchen that usually smelled of rosemary and slow-simmered stocks. They were all in the dining room. Arthur was at the head of the table, looking smug. Julian and Claire were on either side, their faces set in expressions of staged intervention. "You're late," Julian said, checking his watch. "We've been waiting." "I didn't realize I was on a schedule," I said, setting my handbag on the sideboard. I didn't sit down. "Mom, sit," Claire said, gesturing to the chair. "We've ordered food. We wanted to make this easy for you." "Easy for me? Or easy for you so you didn't have to wait for me to cook?" "Elena, please," Arthur said, his voice booming with a false head-of-the-house authority. "We're here because we love you. But your recent behavior, the guest room, the refusal to help with the grandkids, the wine glass incident, it's not you. We think you're depressed. We think you need to see someone." I looked at the three of them. I looked at the pizza boxes on my grandmother's lace tablecloth. I looked at the way they were leaning in, their faces full of a pity that was really just a thinly veiled demand for me to return to my station. "I'm not depressed," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a cold draft. "For 30 years, I have been the floor you walked on. I have been the walls that kept out the wind. I have been the roof that kept you dry, and not once in 30 years did any of you ask if the floor was cracked. You just complained when it got dusty." "That's not fair," Claire cried. "We appreciate everything you do." "Do you? Then tell me, Claire, what is my favorite color? Julian, what is the name of the book I'd been reading on the nightstand for 3 weeks? Arthur, what was the date of our first date? Not our wedding, our first date." Silence followed. A thick, suffocating silence. Arthur looked at the pizza box. Julian looked at his phone. Claire looked at the ceiling. "You don't know," I said, "because I am not a person to you. I am a utility. And as of today, the service has been disconnected." I turned to leave the room. "Where are you going?" Arthur shouted, standing up. "We aren't finished." "I am," I said. I walked to the foyer and picked up the mail that had arrived that afternoon. On top was a thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to Arthur from the Thompson Museum Board. I opened it. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. It was a formal notification. Due to the unprofessional conduct at the gala and concerns regarding the firm's internal stability, the museum project was being put on an indefinite hold. The foundation was crumbling, and they were still arguing about the pizza. I placed the letter on the entry table, right where Arthur would see it when he came out to yell at me again. I went upstairs to the guest room and locked the door. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad. I felt a strange, cold curiosity. I wanted to see how long they would stay in that room, waiting for a mother who no longer lived there, before they realized the house was already empty. I heard the sound of the letter being opened from 2 floors up. It wasn't a loud noise, just the crisp, decisive snap of expensive cardstock being torn. But in the sudden, sharp silence of the foyer, it sounded like a gunshot. The low murmur of Julian and Claire's voices in the dining room died instantly. They were likely still picking at the cold pizza, debating which one of them had the unenviable task of bringing Mom back to her senses. Then came the sound of Arthur's footsteps. They weren't the heavy, confident strides of the man who had marched into the kitchen that morning. They were uneven, staggering. I heard him hit the wall of the hallway, the hollow thud of a man losing his center of gravity. "Elena!" It wasn't a shout.
It was a plea, raw and stripped of the architectural elegance he usually draped over his words. I didn't answer. I sat at the small mahogany desk in the guest room, the light of a single lamp illuminating my grandmother's ledger. I was cross-referencing the quarterly maintenance fees for the firm's office building, a building I technically owned through an inheritance trust he had long ago forgotten was separate from his corporate holdings. The door to the guest room didn't just open. It swung wide, hitting the stopper with a violent metallic ring. Arthur stood there, the cream-colored letter trembling in his hand. Behind him, Julian and Claire hovered in the hallway, their faces pale reflections of his panic. "Did you know about this?" Arthur hissed, holding the paper up as if it were a death warrant. "The Thompson board. They're pulling the project. They're citing reputational instability. They're talking about the gala. They're talking about Mara." "I read the envelope," I said, my voice steady, my eyes never leaving the ledger. It seemed official. "Official? Elena, this is the cornerstone of the firm's next 5 years. If this project goes, the investors for the waterfront development will flee. We'll be hemorrhaging capital by next month." He took a step into the room, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the carpet. "You have to call Beverly Thompson. She listens to you. You two have been charity sisters for a decade. Tell her I'm under stress. Tell her the girl was a temporary lapse. Fix this." I finally looked up. I looked past Arthur, at my children. Julian was staring at the floor, his mind likely calculating how this would affect his own standing, his own inheritance. Claire was looking at me with a terrifyingly sharp desperation. "Mom, he's right," Claire whispered. "If the firm tanks, everything changes. The house, our reputations. I've got clients who only work with me because of the Vance name." "The Vance name," I repeated. The words tasted like ash. "It's a beautiful name, isn't it? Like a well-placed crown molding. But it turns out the name doesn't hold up the roof. I do." "Then do it!" Arthur yelled, his composure finally shattering. "Do what you've always done. Get on the phone. Smooth it over. Be the wife I need you to be." I stood up slowly. I felt a strange, humming vibration in my chest, not of anger, but of absolute, chilling power. It was the power of the person who has nothing left to lose because she has already realized she was never truly seen. "No," I said. The word hung in the air, a small, cold stone. "What do you mean, no?" Julian stepped forward, his face twisting into a mask of indignant confusion. "Mom, this isn't just about Dad's mistake. This is our lives. You can't just quit because you're mad." "I'm not mad, Julian. I'm empty. There is a difference." I walked toward them, and for the first time in their lives, they actually stepped back to let me through. I walked to the landing and looked down at the house I had spent 30 years polishing into a mirror so they could see only their own reflections. "For 30 years," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, "I have been the one to call Beverly Thompson. I have been the one to write the thank you notes, to remember the birthdays, to apologize for Arthur's temper, and to hide his indiscretions from the board. I have been the one to make sure Julian's debts were settled quietly, and that Claire's setbacks never made the papers." I turned back to Arthur. "I have fixed everything you have ever broken. But in doing so, I realized I was just teaching you how to break things better. You didn't become a better man, Arthur. You just became a more reckless one, because you knew I would always be there to sweep up the glass."
I pointed down to the living room. There is still glass in the rug downstairs. Go look. It's still there because I didn't touch it. And I'm not going to touch Beverly Thompson's phone, either. You're destroying us, Arthur whispered. Out of spite. Over a girl who means nothing.
If she meant nothing, Arthur, then why was she in my living room? Why was she drinking my wine? Why was she in the space I built for us? I felt a single tear prick my eye, but I refused to let it fall. She didn't mean nothing. She was the final piece of evidence. She was the proof that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough to make you actually see me. Arthur looked at the letter in his hand, then at me. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the man I had married, the ambitious, slightly clumsy boy who had once promised to build me a castle. But the boy was gone, replaced by a man who had mistaken a support beam for a servant. Get out of my room, I said. This is my house, Elena, Arthur said, though his voice lacked conviction. Actually, I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small blue folder. It's not. Check the deed transfer from 2014, Arthur. The one you signed while you were too busy looking at the plans for the Aspen house to notice what you were initialing. This house, the Oregon property, and the land the firm sits on are all held by Sterling Holdings, and I am the sole officer of Sterling Holdings. The silence that followed was so absolute, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Julian gasped. Claire's hand went to her mouth. Arthur's face went from red to a sickly, translucent white. You stole the house? Julian asked, his voice trembling. I didn't steal anything, Julian. I preserved it. If I hadn't moved these assets, your father would have lost them 3 years ago during the Dubai collapse. I saved this family. I just forgot to save a place for myself within it. I walked back into the guest room and began to close the door. Mom, wait, Claire cried, her voice cracking. What are we supposed to do? I suggest you start by cleaning up the pizza boxes, I said. And the glass. It's very dangerous to leave it there. Someone might get hurt. I closed the door and turned the lock. The click of the bolt was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I sat back down at the desk. I had one more call to make. Not to Beverly Thompson. I dialed Marcus Thorne's private number. Marcus, I said when he picked up. It's Elena. I've decided to move forward with the audit. I want everything exposed. Every shortcut, every bribe, every cent Arthur moved into those consultancy accounts. Are you sure, Elena? Marcus asked, his voice grave. Once we start this, there's no stopping it. It will be the end of the firm. I know, I said, looking out at the gray Seattle rain. But like I told you, Marcus, nothing floats without a cost. And the cost of this building has already been paid in full. I hung up. Below me, I heard the muffled sounds of an argument breaking out, not between me and them, but among themselves. Arthur was yelling at Julian. Julian was blaming Claire. They were turning on each other, the scavengers fighting over the remains of a feast that was no longer being served. I realized, with a quiet, devastating clarity, that they weren't sad about losing me. They were just terrified of being alone with each other. I opened my notebook and crossed off the first name on my list. Arthur. 19 parts to go. Or perhaps just one long, silent aftermath. The house was freezing when I woke up. I had intentionally turned the thermostat down to 55 degrees before I went to bed. In the past, I would have been the first one down, adjusting the dials, ensuring the radiant floor heating in the primary bathroom was perfectly warmed for Arthur's feet. This morning,
I wrapped myself in a heavy wool cardigan and watched my breath form a faint mist in the guest room. I didn't go downstairs until 9. I wanted them to sit in the cold. I wanted them to feel the absence of the invisible hand that usually smoothed the world over for them. When I finally descended, the sight in the kitchen was a tableau of domestic incompetence. Julian was standing at the island, his expensive silk tie tucked into his shirt to avoid the mess he was making. He was trying to use the espresso machine, but he'd jammed the portafilter, and brown liquid was leaking onto the marble. Claire was wrapped in a pashmina, her face blotchy from a night of crying, staring into the open refrigerator as if the food might jump out and prepare itself. Arthur was absent. I could hear the muffled, frantic tone of his voice coming from the den. He was on the phone, likely with his lawyers or the firm's CFO, trying to verify the nightmare I had handed him last night. "Mom," Julian said, his voice cracking. He looked like he hadn't slept. "The heat isn't working. I checked the breaker, but I don't know." "The heat is working perfectly, Julian," I said, walking to the kettle to boil water for my tea. "I simply turned it down. We're entering a season of conservation. It's best to get used to the chill." "Conservation?" Claire snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of cold and indignation. "Mom, this is ridiculous. We're adults. We have lives. You can't just turn off the house because you're having a disagreement with Dad." "A disagreement?" I turned to look at her. I noticed she was wearing my favorite cashmere slippers, the ones Julian had given me for Christmas 3 years ago. She hadn't asked. She had just taken them because her feet were cold. "Is that what you call it, Claire? When your father brings his mistress into my home and your brother expects me to be his permanent unpaid nanny and you treat me like a personal assistant? You call that a disagreement?" "We're sorry about Mara," Julian interjected, stepping away from the leaking espresso machine. "Okay? Dad knows he messed up. He's a wreck. But the house? The firm? You're talking about destroying our legacy, my inheritance, Claire's standing. Do you even realize what you're doing?" I watched the steam rise from the kettle. A psychological insight hit me then, sharp and cold as the air in the room. They weren't mourning the potential loss of our family unit. They were mourning the loss of their own comfort. They didn't see me as a woman who had been pushed to the edge. They saw me as a bank that had suddenly closed its doors during a financial crisis. "Your inheritance, Julian, was built on the back of my silence," I said softly. "Every time I didn't complain about the 60-hour weeks I put into the firm's books while your father took the credit, your inheritance grew. Every time I didn't divorce him 20 years ago when he had that incident in Chicago, your legacy was preserved. You've been living on a credit line of my endurance. The limit has been reached." The door to the den slammed open. Arthur walked out, his face a pale, ghostly gray. He was holding a stack of papers, copies he must have found in his home office files now that he knew what to look for. "Sterling Holdings," he whispered, his voice devoid of its usual resonance. "I called Ben at the firm. He wouldn't even talk to me. He said he'd received a notice of interest from a legal team representing the property owner, my own CFO, Elena. He's scared of you." "Ben is a smart man, Arthur. He knows who actually signs the checks for the building's lease. He knows that if Sterling Holdings decides to terminate the lease, Vance and Associates doesn't have a floor to stand on. Literally." Arthur slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat for decades, presiding over us like a king. Now, He looked like a commoner in his own palace. "What do you want?" he asked. "Money? You already have it. The firm? You don't even like architecture. What is the point of this?" "The point, Arthur, is that I want to see what you are without me," I said. "I want to see if Julian can manage a weekend with his own children without a safety net. I want to see if Claire can maintain her social status without the Vance matriarch smoothing her path. And I want to see if you can build anything at all, on a foundation of your own making without me there to hold the levels." "You're a monster," Claire whispered, her eyes wide with a genuine, terrifying realization. "You've been planning this. You've been watching us, waiting for us to fail so you could do this." "I wasn't waiting for you to fail, Claire. I was waiting for you to notice I was drowning. But you were all too busy using my head as a stepping stone to keep your own feet dry." I picked up my tea and began to walk toward the stairs. "Wait," Arthur called out, a sudden, desperate edge to his voice. "The audit. Marcus Thorne called me. He said you've authorized a full forensic sweep. Elena, if they look at the 2019 filings, the way we handled the subcontractors for the library project, I could lose my license. I could go to prison." I paused on the first step. I didn't turn around. "Then I suggest you find a very good lawyer, Arthur. One who doesn't mind a client whose primary assets are currently under new management." "Mom, please," Julian shouted. "Think about the grandkids. What is this going to do to their future?" "Their future will be built on the truth, Julian, not on the gilded lies their grandfather told and their grandmother curated. Perhaps they'll grow up to be people who know how to make their own coffee." I went back to the guest room and closed the door. I could hear the explosion of noise below, Arthur's sobbing, Claire's screaming, Julian's frantic dialing on his cell phone. It was the sound of a structure collapsing in real time. I sat at the desk and opened my notebook. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my stomach. It wasn't regret. It was the feeling of a space that had been occupied by a heavy weight for 30 years, suddenly being emptied. My phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "The auditors are in. They found the first discrepancy within 20 minutes. Arthur was moving funds to a private account in Mara's name. Quite a lot of funds, Elena. More than just a distraction." I closed my eyes. The imbalance was worse than I thought. He wasn't just replacing me emotionally. He was systematically dismantling our shared security to build a nest for a girl who hadn't even been born when we bought this house. I realized then that my isolation strategy wasn't just a punishment. It was a salvage operation. I looked out the window. The rain had stopped, and the Seattle sky was a bruising shade of purple. I wondered how long it would take for them to realize that the heat wasn't just turned down. It was never coming back on. By the third morning of my retirement, the house began to smell like a locker room. It's a subtle thing at first. The scent of damp towels left in a heap because no one thought to hang them up. The sour tang of milk crusting at the bottom of a cereal bowl left on the mahogany sideboard. I sat in the library, the only room I still kept impeccably clean. It was my sanctuary now. I had moved a small electric kettle and my tea supplies here. I didn't want to navigate the minefield of the kitchen, which had become a graveyard of takeout containers and half-eaten sandwiches. I heard the front door slam. A moment later, high-pitched shrieks erupted in the foyer. My grandchildren. Sarah, Julian's wife, had arrived. I could hear her voice, sharp, breathless, and tinged with that frantic, young mother energy she usually used to command my attention. "Julian, where are you? The kids are losing it, and I have a hair appointment at 10. Where's your mother?" I didn't move. I leaned back in my chair and picked up a book of poetry I hadn't touched since college. I heard the heavy tread of the three of them, Arthur, Julian, and Sarah, approaching the library. They didn't knock.
They burst in like a search party finding a survivor in the wreckage. Sarah was holding 3-year-old Leo, who was screaming for a juice box. 5-year-old Mia was trailing behind, her face smeared with something purple. "Elena," Sarah gasped, her eyes scanning the room. She looked at my tea, my book, and my calm expression with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "Julian called me. He said you were sick? But you look fine. Thank God. Can you take Leo? I'm late, and Julian says he has to go into the firm to meet with the lawyers." "I'm not sick, Sarah," I said, my voice barely audible over Leo's mounting tantrum. "And I'm not taking Leo." Sarah froze. She looked at Julian, then back at me. "I don't understand. It's Friday. Friday is Grandma Day. We've had this schedule for 2 years." "The schedule has been canceled," I said, "indefinitely. If you have an appointment, I suggest you take the children with you, or perhaps Julian can take them to the firm. I'm sure his lawyers won't mind the background noise." "Mom, stop it," Julian snapped, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple. "Sarah has had a brutal week. I'm trying to save our lives. Can you just be a mother for 5 minutes?" "I have been a mother for 32 years, Julian. I have been a grandmother for 5. In all that time, have you ever once asked me if I had plans on a Friday? Or did you just assume that my time had no value because I didn't charge you for it?" Leo's screaming intensified. Sarah's eyes began to well with tears, her go-to move when logic failed her. "Elena, please, I'm exhausted. We're all exhausted. Why are you doing this to us? What did the kids ever do to you?" "The children are innocent, Sarah, which is why it's a shame their parents and grandfather have built a life so fragile that a single woman sitting in a library causes it to shatter." I stood up and walked to the door. "Now please take the children out of here. I'm reading." "You're a cold, selfish woman," Sarah hissed as she retreated, Leo still wailing in her arms. "I hope you enjoy your silence, because once this is over, don't expect us to come back. You'll be alone in this big, empty house, and you'll deserve it." "Sarah!" I called out as they reached the foyer. She turned, a flicker of hope in her eyes that I was about to relent. "The house isn't empty. It's just quiet. There's a difference." After they left, the house vibrating with the force of their collective resentment, Arthur stayed behind. He was leaning against the doorframe of the library, looking at me with a strange, analytical expression. He had finally shaved, and he was wearing a crisp white shirt, though he hadn't managed the cufflinks. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing the aging skin of his forearms. "You really don't care, do you?" he asked. "You've turned off your heart like a light switch." "My heart didn't have a switch, Arthur. It had a battery. And you drained it. You, the kids, the firm, you all just kept plugging in your demands until there was nothing left." "I found the account, Elena," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The one in Mara's name. The one you told the auditors about." "And?" "It wasn't what you think. I wasn't building a life with her. I was trying to feel young. I was trying to prove I could still be the man who built things from nothing. The money was just a way to keep her interested. She's a girl, Elena. She likes things." "She likes my things, Arthur. That money came from the Sterling Trust. You didn't just betray our marriage, you embezzled from the very foundation that kept your children's future secure. You took from Julian and Claire to buy interest from a 34-year-old girl." Arthur flinched. He walked over to my desk and sat in the chair opposite me. For the first time in years, we were eye to eye, without a dinner table or a social function between us.
"If you go through with the audit," he said, "I'll lose the house. I'll lose the firm. I'll probably lose my freedom. Is that what you want? To see the father of your children in a jumpsuit?" "What I want, Arthur, is the truth. If the truth puts you in a jumpsuit, then that is simply the architecture of your own making." I leaned forward, the psychological weight of the last 3 decades pressing into the space between us. "You think I'm being cruel. But tell me, Arthur, if the roles were reversed? If I had been the one moving money, the one bringing a young man into this house, the one neglecting you for decades? Would you be sitting here trying to smooth it over? Or would you have thrown me out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back?" Arthur looked away. He couldn't answer because he knew the truth. He would have been ruthless. He would have been efficient. He would have viewed my betrayal as a structural flaw that needed to be demolished immediately. "I'm leaving today," I said. He looked back at me, sharp and sudden. "Leaving? To where?" "To the Oregon house. Alone." "You can't. The locks were changed by the owner, Arthur. And as we established, that's me. I'm going to sit by the ocean and listen to the waves. I'm going to leave you here with the sour milk and the broken glass and the children who don't know how to be adults because I never forced them to learn." "Elena, you can't leave me like this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I don't even know how to pay the property taxes. I don't know where the insurance files are. The firm is in chaos." "Then I suggest you start learning, Arthur. It's a bit late in the season for a renovation, but I suppose even an old building can be retrofitted if the owner is desperate enough." I picked up my small suitcase, which I had packed the night before. I walked past him, out of the library, and toward the front door. As I reached the threshold, I looked back at the house.
The grand staircase, the crystal chandelier, the expensive art, it all looked like a stage set after the play had closed. It was beautiful, but it was dead. "One last thing, Arthur," I said. He looked up from the library chair, a pathetic glimmer of hope on his face. "The Thompson project isn't the only thing you lost this morning. I called the club. I resigned our membership. And I told Beverly Thompson why. I didn't lie. I just told her I was tired of being the only one holding up the ceiling." I walked out and closed the door. The silence of the street was a gift. I got into my car and drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I knew what was there. A man standing in a cold house, wondering why the lights wouldn't come on. And a family that was about to realize that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a woman's rage. It's her indifference. The Oregon house sits on a jagged cliff of black basalt, overlooking a stretch of the Pacific that feels old and indifferent. I have always loved this place because the ocean doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't need to be polished, fed, or managed. It just exists in a state of constant, rhythmic upheaval. I arrived at dusk. The air was sharp with salt and the scent of damp pine. For the first time in my life, I didn't enter a house and immediately begin an audit of its needs. I didn't check the pantry for staples. I didn't look for dust on the mantel. I simply walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the tide come in. The silence was total. It wasn't the heavy, accusatory silence of the Seattle house, the silence of things unsaid. This was the silence of a space that had finally been cleared of other people's expectations. I kept my phone in my handbag, buried under a scarf. I didn't look at it until the next morning, as I sat on the deck with a cup of coffee. When I finally pressed the screen,
The device shuddered under the weight of 34 missed calls and over 50 text messages. It was a digital map of a collapsing empire. "Mom, where are you?" "The alarm at the house went off, and I don't have the new code. The police showed up, and Dad wouldn't come out of the den. Please, call me." Julian, 11:14 p.m. "Elena, this is Sarah. Leo has a fever of 102. I can't find the pediatrician's emergency number in your desk. Why aren't you answering? This is cruel." Sarah, 1:45 a.m. "The firm's servers are locked, Elena. The IT department says there's a legal hold on the domain. Did you do this? I have a meeting with the partners in 4 hours. You are destroying my life. Answer your phone." Arthur, 5:30 a.m. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity as I read them. Not guilt, not panic. I felt like a scientist observing a chemical reaction that was finally reaching its inevitable, volatile conclusion. The most telling message was from Claire. "Mom, I'm at the house. It's a disaster. Dad is sitting in the kitchen drinking room-temperature gin. He says you stole the company. Julian and Sarah are screaming at each other in the foyer. No one has eaten. I don't know where the spare keys to the pantry are. Please, just tell us what you want so we can go back to normal." Normal. I looked out at the horizon, where the gray sky met the gray water. Their normal was a house where every need was anticipated, every conflict smoothed over, and every betrayal absorbed by a woman who had agreed to be a ghost. They didn't want me back because they loved me. They wanted me back because the machinery of their lives had stopped, and they were too proud, or too incompetent, to pick up the tools themselves. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I called the local grocery delivery service and ordered exactly enough food for one person for 1 week. Around noon, a car pulled into the gravel driveway. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The aggressive, uneven crunch of the tires told me it was Julian. He had always been an impatient driver. I met him on the deck. He looked unkempt. His expensive stubble had turned into a patchy, desperate beard, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't look at the ocean. He looked at me, as if I were a hostage negotiator who had just stopped talking. "You're here," he said, his voice raw. "I drove 5 hours. I called every hotel in the area until a desk clerk recognized your name." "You should have saved the gas, Julian," I said. "I'm not coming back." "You have to. He's losing it, Mom. He's talking about liquidating his personal accounts to pay off Mara's father so he won't sue for wrongful termination or whatever. But he can't even get into the accounts. The bank says they're under administrative review." "Administrative review is a polite way of saying I've flagged them for the audit," I said. He shouldn't have been using the Sterling Trust as a slush fund for his mistress's family. Julian took a step toward me, his hands shaking. "And what about us? Sarah is talking about leaving me, Mom. She says if I can't provide the life we had, if we lose the house and the help, she's gone. She's taking the kids to her mother's in Florida. Do you want that? Do you want your grandchildren 1,000 miles away because you wanted to prove a point?" I looked at my son. I saw the fear in him, the genuine primal fear of a man who had never been taught how to be a man, only how to be a Vance. "If Sarah leaves you because you don't have a gardener and a full-time nanny, Julian, then she isn't leaving a husband. She's leaving a service contract. Is that the kind of marriage you want? Because that's the one I had. And look at where I am." "It's not the same!" he yelled, the sound echoing off the cliffs. You and Dad, you were a team. You built everything. No, Julian. Your father built the sketches. I built the reality. And now, I've decided to stop maintaining the illusion. If Sarah wants to go to Florida, let her go. Maybe in the heat, you'll both finally wake up.
You're a stranger, he whispered, looking at me with a mixture of fear and loathing. I don't even recognize you. You're just cold, like stone. I'm not stone, Julian. I'm just finally solid. For 30 years, I was water. I took the shape of whatever container you all put me in. I flowed into the cracks to keep the structure from freezing. But water can only be poured for so long before the pitcher is empty. I turned my back on him and walked toward the sliding glass door. Mom, wait! I paused, my hand on the handle. Dad said, he said Marcus Thorne is helping you. Is that true? Are you really going to help the man who tried to ruin Dad 20 years ago? Marcus didn't try to ruin your father, Julian. Your father ruined Marcus, and I helped him do it because I thought I was protecting our family. I'm just correcting a structural error. It's never too late for a renovation. I went inside and locked the door. I watched through the glass as Julian stood on the deck for a long time. He looked small against the vastness of the Oregon coast. He eventually kicked a decorative planter, one I had hand-painted years ago, and stormed back to his car. As he drove away, spraying gravel across the lawn, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't the sharp pain of a mother's heartbreak. It was the dull, fading ache of a phantom limb. I was mourning the son I thought I had raised, while finally meeting the man I had actually created. I went to the kitchen and began to unpack my groceries. A single loaf of bread, a small jar of jam, 1 carton of eggs. The house felt larger now. The isolation wasn't a punishment I was inflicting on them. It was a mirror. I had removed myself, and in the emptiness I left behind, they were finally forced to see exactly what they were. I realized then that they wouldn't stop. They would keep coming. First Julian, then Claire, and eventually, when the walls truly started to fall, Arthur. I looked at the phone on the counter. It buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Elena. It's Mara. We need to talk. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know what he was doing. Please. People are saying I'm the reason the firm is failing. I didn't delete it. I just left it there. A small, glowing ember of a fire I was no longer interested in putting out. I sat down and ate my toast in the perfect, undisturbed silence of my own company. The final collapse didn't happen in a courtroom or a boardroom. It happened on the gravel driveway of the Oregon house, under a sky so clear and indifferent, it felt like a mockery. Arthur arrived at sunset. He didn't come in his luxury sedan. He arrived in a taxi, his clothes rumpled, looking like a man who had been evicted from his own life. He didn't scream. He didn't demand. He simply sat on the porch steps and waited until I came out. "It's over, Elena," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The board met this morning. They've moved to dissolve the partnership. Marcus Thorne is taking over the remaining assets. I'm being phased out to avoid a public scandal. I have nothing." I sat in the wicker chair opposite him, a blanket tucked around my knees. I looked at the man I had spent my youth and middle age protecting. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a building, grand on the outside, but with the floors and wiring ripped out. "You have the Seattle house, Arthur," I said quietly. "I've transferred the deed back into your name today.
And I've done the same for Julian and Claire's trust funds. They're no longer under Sterling Holdings. He looked up, a spark of pathetic hope igniting in his eyes. You gave it back? Why? After everything you said, why would you give us the house? Because I realized that the greatest punishment I could give you wasn't taking things away, I said. It was giving you exactly what you wanted. You wanted your status. You wanted that house. You wanted your family to stay together under your roof.
Arthur stood up, his hands shaking. Elena, thank you. I knew you'd come around. We can fix this. We'll sell the house, move somewhere smaller, start a boutique firm. I'll fire Mara. Mara isn't going anywhere, Arthur, I interrupted. He blinked. What do you mean? I'm done with her. I'll never see her again. Mara called me an hour ago. She's pregnant. The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear the tide hitting the rocks below. Arthur's face went a translucent, sickly white. She can't be, he whispered. She is. And since I've transferred the house and the remaining liquid assets back to you, you are now legally responsible for her, the child, and the massive tax debt I neglected to pay on the Seattle property for the last 3 years. You see, Arthur, I didn't steal your money. I just stopped managing the consequences of your lifestyle. I stood up, the blanket falling to the floor. I gave you the house, Arthur. And I've invited Julian, Sarah, and the kids to move back in with you, since they can no longer afford their mortgage. And I've suggested to Mara that she move in as well, given her condition. You're a family man, after all. You should all be together. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked at me with a dawning horror that was far more satisfying than any scream. He saw the trap. I had given them the complete isolation of each other. I had locked them in a gilded cage of their own making. A house filled with a husband who had betrayed everyone, a mistress who was now a permanent burden, and children who would resent their father for the rest of their lives for the loss of their easy inheritance. They would be stuck in that house, surrounded by the ghosts of the life I had curated for them, forced to actually live with the people they had become. You're leaving us there? Arthur whispered. With each other? With her? You said I was a controlling kind, Arthur. This is my final act of management. I am providing you with the structure you designed. I'm just removing myself from the load-bearing walls. I walked to my car, which was already idling. My lawyer, Marcus Thorne's daughter, a woman who had been my secret ally for months, was in the driver's seat. Arthur followed me to the door, his hands outstretched. Elena, you can't. Who's going to make the calls? Who's going to fix the mistakes? We don't know how to live without you. That, I said, stepping into the car, is the architecture of your new life. I suggest you study the blueprints carefully. It's a very long way down. As we drove away, I looked in the side mirror. Arthur was standing alone in the gravel, the massive, dark Pacific Ocean at his back, and a life of suffocating, crowded silence ahead of him. He had always wanted to be the center of the world. Now, he was the center of a ruin. I turned forward and looked at the road. For the first time in 32 years, the air in the car didn't feel heavy. It felt thin, cold, and perfectly, beautifully empty.